The enigmatic rebel. The small village of Ukubwa was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, a quiet town where life seemed to follow a steady rhythm. The sun rose over the rolling hills, casting golden light over the mud brick houses and the lively market where traders hawked fruits, fabrics, and handcrafted goods. It was a place of peace and community, a village that thrived on tradition, rules, and harmony. But there was one name that haunted every conversation, a name spoken in hushed tones, full of unease. That name was Zara. Zara was a girl unlike any other in Ukubwa. Tall and striking, with long hair that cascaded down her back like a waterfall of black silk, she carried herself with an air of defiance that set her apart from the others. Her appearance alone made her the subject of many whispers, her unruly hair, the long skirts that flowed around her, and the gold rings that adorned her fingers were all signs of rebellion in a town that prized conformity. She didn't fit in, and she didn't care. From the moment Zara set foot in the village school, she became a legend of sorts. It wasn't just her beauty that drew attention, though that alone was enough to make the girls jealous and the boys stammer. No, Zara was a rebel, a girl who seemed to have no regard for rules or authority. She walked into school with her hair unkempt, ignored the strict dress code, and wore makeup even though the school frowned on it. While other girls cowered to the strict headmistress and teachers, Zara openly challenged them. She was untouchable, or so it seemed. No one dared speak out against her, not the students, not the teachers, not even the elders of the town. The rumors surrounding Zara only added to her mystique. Strange accidents seemed to follow in her wake, each more bizarre than the last. A teacher who once scolded her for chewing gum in class fell ill with a strange fever that no doctor could cure. His skin turned red and rash-covered, and he was bedridden for weeks. Another teacher, who had been particularly harsh with Zara after a minor infraction, drowned while swimming in the river, even though he had always been a strong swimmer. There were others too, people who crossed Zara's path, only to suffer misfortune shortly after. It was as though she had an unseen power, something that no one understood but everyone feared. At first, the villagers whispered behind her back, speaking of Zara as if she were cursed or chosen by dark forces. Some even called her a witch, though they never dared say it to her face. Zara never acknowledged the gossip, walking through the streets with her head held high, her eyes sharp and piercing. She was untouchable, and she knew it. But Zara was not alone in her mysterious ways. There was another figure, one who cast a long shadow over her life, her mother, Nia. Nia lived on the outskirts of Ukubwa, far from the prying eyes of the village. Her house sat at the edge of the dense forest, a place few dared venture. Nia was a woman of few words and an unsettling presence. With her pale skin, sharp features, and golden eyes that glowed like fire, she was a figure of awe and fear. No one knew where she came from or how she ended up in Ukubwa. She had appeared one day, years ago, and set up a small, isolated home by the river, away from the rest of the village. The townsfolk believed Nia was a witch, and though no one could prove it, they whispered that she held dark powers. It was said that if you stood too close to her house, you could feel the air grow heavy, as if the land itself was steeped in magic. People avoided her, walking a wide circle around her home, never daring to intrude unless absolutely necessary. And yet, it was Nia who had brought Zara into the world, and it was Nia who had taught her the ways of the village in her own enigmatic way. Zara's connection to Nia was something no one truly understood. Many assumed that Zara, with her rebellious spirit and defiant nature, had inherited something from her mother, something dark, something dangerous. The two of them were like shadows, moving through the village and its surrounding forest, as if they existed on the edge of reality, separate from the lives of everyone else. Though Zara's rebellious nature was well known, it was Nia's reputation that fed into the rumors about them both. Zara's behavior could be explained away as simple teenage defiance, but the whispers about Nia made it clear that there was something more, something far deeper and far darker, at play. It was no secret that Zara was different. Her behavior, her very presence, was a mystery, and the villagers had long ago accepted that they would never truly understand her or the strange woman she called her mother. They simply avoided them both, hoping that whatever it was that made them so unsettling would stay far away, the arrival of a new teacher. The quiet rhythms of Ukubwa were disrupted one warm morning when the village school received a new teacher. Her name was Mrs. Tumi, and from the very moment she stepped into the classroom, it was clear she was a woman who commanded attention. She was tall, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Her presence was calming yet powerful, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence that radiated authority. Unlike the teachers before her, who had either been too fearful or too lenient with the rebellious students, Mrs. Tumi was different. She was not intimidated by Zara's infamous reputation or the whispers that followed the girl's every move. From the very first day, Mrs. Tumi made it clear that she was not like the others. She did not cower when Zara shot her a defiant glare or when the students spoke in hushed tones about Zara's latest mischief. Mrs. Tumi simply walked into the classroom, stood before the chalkboard, and began the lesson as though she were the unquestioned ruler of that space. Her confidence was like a shield that nothing seemed capable of penetrating. Zara, as always, sat at the back of the classroom, a position she had long claimed as her own. She watched Mrs. Tumi closely, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. There was something about the new teacher that unsettled her, a quiet strength, a resoluteness that Zara hadn't seen in anyone else before. It made her uneasy, as though this teacher could see through her, past all the layers of defiance and arrogance that Zara had carefully built around herself. As the days went by, the tension between Zara and Mrs. Tumi became palpable. Zara tested the new teacher's patience, as she always did with authority figures. She would arrive late to class, refuse to hand in assignments, and challenge Mrs. Tumi's every instruction. But Mrs. Tumi never flinched. She simply responded with calm but firm authority, never raising her voice or showing any signs of losing control. The other students watched with a mix of awe and confusion. No one had ever stood up to Zara this way before. The final straw came one morning when Mrs. Tumi noticed Zara's long, unruly hair. It was against the school rules to have long hair without it being tied back, yet Zara's hair flowed freely, untamed and wild. Mrs. Tumi, with a calm but firm voice, addressed the class, her eyes landing on Zara. "Zara," she began, her tone not angry but resolute, "I've asked you several times to keep your hair tied up as per the school's rules. It's a matter of discipline, and we all must follow the guidelines." Zara, as always, met her gaze with a defiant smirk. "I don't tie my hair for anyone," she shot back, her voice dripping with challenge. The class held its breath. No one dared speak up. Zara's rebelliousness had become legendary, and no teacher had ever truly dared to challenge her. But Mrs. Tumi was different. She didn't flinch or back down. Instead, she walked to the front of the class, her eyes never leaving Zara's. "Then perhaps I will take matters into my own hands," Mrs. Tumi said, her voice low but confident. "Zara, I have given you a chance, but it's time for you to follow the rules. I'm asking you to cut your hair." There was a stunned silence in the room. Zara's eyes widened, her smirk faltering for the first time. No one had ever dared to challenge her appearance before. She was used to people accepting her defiance, even if they didn't understand it. But Mrs. Tumi, she wasn't like the others. Zara's hands clenched into fists. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, but she wasn't going to let Mrs. Tumi see it. "You can't tell me what to do," Zara hissed, her voice cold with fury. "I don't answer to you." Mrs. Tumi's gaze was steady. "I'm afraid you do," she said softly, and then without another word, she reached into her bag and pulled out a pair of scissors. The classroom watched, wide-eyed, as Mrs. Tumi walked toward Zara. Zara's heart raced. She couldn't believe this was happening. But before she could react, before she could even say another word, Mrs. Tumi was standing before her, scissors in hand. With a swift, decisive motion, she snipped off a large portion of Zara's long, black hair. A gasp rippled through the class. Zara's breath caught in her throat as she felt the weight of the hair fall to the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she could hardly move. It wasn't the act itself that stunned her, it was the fact that someone had dared to do it. Someone had dared to take control away from her. Zara's cheeks flushed with humiliation, and her hands trembled with rage. She felt the heat of fury rise in her chest, and for a moment, the room seemed to blur around her. The challenge had been issued, and Zara could feel it deep in her bones. She would make Mrs. Tumi regret this. You regret this, Zara whispered through gritted teeth, her voice shaking with anger. But Mrs. Tumi, unfazed, merely smiled a small, knowing smile. Perhaps, she said softly, but rules are rules, Zara. The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, but Zara didn't move. She sat frozen in her seat, the weight of the humiliation pressing down on her. Her hair, once her pride, was now reduced to a handful of strands on the floor. As the students filtered out of the classroom, they glanced back at Zara, some of them hesitant, some of them nervous. No one spoke a word. It was as if the entire class had just witnessed something monumental, something that would change everything. But Zara, for the first time, didn't seem so sure of herself. There was something about Mrs. Tumi that made her uneasy, something she couldn't quite place. And deep down, for the first time, Zara began to wonder if she might have met her match. A dangerous ultimatum. The following morning, the tension in the air was palpable as the students gathered in the classroom. Zara walked in slowly, her gaze cold and focused. She could still feel the sting of humiliation from the day before, the weight of Mrs. Tumi's scissors cutting through more than just her hair. It felt as though a part of her pride had been severed too. Zara's defiance had always been her armor, the thing that made her untouchable. But now, with her long hair gone and her reputation slightly cracked, she felt exposed, vulnerable for the first time in years. The class was quieter than usual, the students glancing at her nervously. They knew something was off. They had never seen Zara like this. But none dared to speak a word, knowing how quickly Zara could lash out. As Mrs. Tumi entered the room, her calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the storm that churned inside Zara. She walked to the front of the class and set her things down, her eyes briefly meeting Zara's. Zara, for a moment, considered what to do, whether to challenge her again or remain silent. But the humiliation from the day before was still too raw. Without thinking, Zara stood up abruptly, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. You will regret this, Zara spat, her words sharp and cutting. Mrs. Tumi didn't flinch. Instead, she met Zara's gaze calmly, as if she had expected this outburst. Regret what, Zara? The rules are clear. I gave you a chance, but you chose to ignore them. Now, you have to live with the consequences. The words were cold, but they felt like a slap to Zara's already bruised pride. She could feel the anger rising, her fist clenching tightly by her sides. Her mind raced, thoughts of revenge and retribution flashing through her. No one had ever humiliated her this way before, and she wasn't about to let it go unpunished. That night, as the moon hung high in the sky, Zara could no longer hold back her fury. She stormed out of her house and made her way down the narrow path to the river that bordered the village. The darkness seemed to welcome her, as if the very earth knew what was about to unfold. When she reached the water's edge, she knelt down and stared at the rippling surface, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mama," she called into the night, her voice trembling with both rage and desperation. "Mama, help me. Help me make her pay for this." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the river's gentle flow, the moonlight dancing on the water's surface. But then, slowly, the air grew heavier, and Zara felt a chill crawl down her spine. She waited, holding her breath, until she heard the voice that had guided her through her darkest moments, the voice of Nia, her mother. "I hear you, my child," Nia's voice whispered, calm and soothing, but filled with an undeniable menace. The voice seemed to come from the very depths of the river, echoing through Zara's bones. "You want revenge, do you? You want to make her feel your pain?" Zara's heart raced, her fist tightening in the dirt. "Yes," she whispered, her words raw with emotion. "She humiliated me in front of everyone. She deserves to suffer for it." From the depths of the water, Zara could sense the ripples of power stirring. It was the power of Nia, the power that could shape the world around them with a thought. "Very well," Nia replied, her voice filled with dark satisfaction. "No one hurts my daughter and lives to tell the tale. I will make sure Mrs. Tumi regrets her actions. Just leave it to me." Zara felt a chill sweep through her as the last of her anger melted into a quiet sense of relief. She had called upon the only force she knew could make things right. But in the back of her mind, a small, nagging voice told her that she had crossed a dangerous line. There would be no going back from this. The following night, the town of Okubwa was shaken by an unsettling event. Mrs. Tumi's house, tucked on the edge of the village, caught fire. The flames spread with unnatural speed, consuming the wooden structure in minutes. The villagers awoke to the crackling sound of burning timber and rushed to help, but the fire raged so intensely that no one could get close. The air was thick with smoke, and the heat was unbearable. Zara, standing in the shadows of her own home, watched the fire with a mixture of fear and satisfaction. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she told herself it was for the best. Mrs. Tumi had humiliated her, and now she would pay. But the next morning, as the villagers gathered around the charred remains of Mrs. Tumi's house, something impossible happened. Mrs. Tumi herself emerged from the wreckage, walking out from the smoldering ruins as if she had been untouched by the flames. Her clothes were singed, and her face was streaked with soot, but there was no sign of the horrific burns that should have claimed her life. The onlookers gasped in disbelief. No one could understand it. How had she survived the inferno? Some whispered that it was a miracle, others that she was a spirit, a being of more than human flesh. But one thing was certain, Mrs. Tumi was no ordinary teacher. Word of her miraculous survival spread quickly through the village, and the fear that had once surrounded Zara now began to shift toward Mrs. Tumi. The villagers, who had once feared Zara's presence, now whispered about Mrs. Tumi in the same hushed tones. Who was she really? How had she withstood the curse that had so easily taken others? Was she a witch? A spirit? Or something more dangerous? Zara felt a knot form in her stomach. She had underestimated Mrs. Tumi. It was clear now that this teacher was not just a simple mortal. She was something far more powerful than Zara had anticipated, and for the first time, Zara felt true fear. The power that she had once relied on so confidently, her mother's dark influence, might not be enough to defeat someone like Mrs. Tumi. As the whispers of Mrs. Tumi's survival spread, Zara began to understand that the stakes had just gotten much higher. The game of defiance and humiliation was no longer one she controlled. Something far more dangerous was at play, and she had no idea how it would end. The battle begins. Zara's world was falling apart. The fear she once held over the villagers and teachers was slipping through her fingers as Mrs. Tumi remained unshaken by every attack, every curse that Zara or her mother, Nia, sent her way. Nia's powers were vast, her influence dark and ancient, but they didn't seem to have the same effect on Mrs. Tumi. The woman had withstood a fire, survived curses, and stood tall in the face of every threat Zara could muster. Each day that passed, Zara's anger and fear grew, gnawing at her insides. For the first time in her life, she was not in control. The teacher who had humiliated her, cut her hair, and survived every curse Zara had tried, was becoming more than just a foe. She was a threat, one that Zara could not defeat with mere anger or power. One night, Zara sat alone in her room, her thoughts swirling in confusion and frustration. Her mind raced with dark thoughts of what might be the only solution to her problem, Nia. Zara had always relied on her mother's power, the very force that had given her the strength to survive so far. Nia had never failed her before, but now, Zara feared that Mrs. Tumi was too strong, too resilient for her mother's magic to be enough. And yet, it was the only way. As the moon rose high in the sky, casting its eerie glow over the village, Zara walked to the river once more, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. She knew what she had to do. "Mama," she called softly into the darkness, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "Please, help me." The river responded with the same heavy silence that had greeted her before. Zara waited, her breath shallow. And then, as if the night itself had stirred, Nia's voice came, as dark and foreboding as the river's depths. "What is it, my child?" Nia's voice was both soothing and terrifying, echoing through Zara's very bones. "What do you want from me now?" Zara's lips trembled as she spoke, her anger barely contained. "I need you to deal with her, Mama. Mrs. Tumi, she's too strong. She's humiliating me, controlling everything, and I can't stop her. Please, make her leave me alone." There was a long pause. Zara held her breath, waiting for a response. And then, the water shifted, dark and turbulent as Nia spoke again. "You want me to deal with her? Very well." Nia's voice was thick with power now. "I will make sure she does not challenge you again, Zara. She will understand her place." Zara felt the ground beneath her feet tremble as Nia's words wrapped around her like a tightening noose. Her mother's power had always been a comfort, but now it felt more like a force she couldn't control. She didn't have much time to consider the implications of what was happening before the water began to churn violently. "Come to me, then," Nia's voice commanded, filled with ancient power. "I will show you what true strength is." Without hesitation, Zara rushed to the riverbank, where the dark water swirled as if alive. And then, as the river seemed to break open, Nia emerged. But not as the woman Zara knew. No, this was something far more terrifying. The water parted to reveal a massive serpent, its shimmering scales glistening like liquid silver in the moonlight. Nia's eyes, glowing with an eerie golden light, fixed on Zara, filled with an ancient malice. Her mouth opened, revealing rows of razor-sharp fangs as her voice hissed through the air. "She will learn that no one defies me." Zara's heart pounded, but she could feel her anger swell again. She nodded, her voice shaking but determined. "Make her pay, Mama. Show her who you are." Nia turned, her massive form shifting through the night with unnatural grace. She slithered toward the village, the ground trembling beneath her massive weight. Zara followed at a distance, a twisted satisfaction forming in her chest. Her mother was unstoppable. Mrs. Tumi wouldn't stand a chance. At the same time, Mrs. Tumi was preparing for the storm ahead. The rumors had reached her, the whispers of dark forces gathering at the edge of the village. She knew that Zara would not let her humiliation go unpunished. But unlike the others who had feared Zara's wrath, Mrs. Tumi did not quiver. She had faced the unknown before, and she would face it again. The storm came in waves, fierce and unrelenting. Lightning flashed across the sky as the ground trembled with the arrival of Nia. The massive serpent loomed in front of Mrs. Tumi's house, its eyes glowing bright as fire. Nia's voice echoed like thunder, shaking the very air. "Leave my daughter alone, human." But Mrs. Tumi stood her ground, unshaken by the serpent's looming form. "I will not cower before you," she said, her voice steady and calm. "If you think you can intimidate me, there you are mistaken." Without warning, Nia lunged, her powerful body coiling through the air, her fangs bared to strike. But Mrs. Tumi moved with a speed and precision that seemed almost supernatural, her hand gripping a long staff that she had brought with her. With a swift motion, she thrust the staff toward Nia, pushing her back with all her strength. The battle that followed was brutal and relentless. Nia struck with all the fury of a creature wronged, her massive form twisting through the air, her glowing eyes burning with hatred. But Mrs. Tumi was a warrior at heart. She fought with the skill of someone who had faced horrors far greater than the serpent's wrath. Every strike from Nia was met with a swift parry, each of Mrs. Tumi's movements precise and calculated. As Nia lunged again, Mrs. Tumi ducked and roared, her staff swinging with deadly accuracy. The serpent roared in fury as Mrs. Tumi's blow struck home, knocking Nia back with a force that sent ripples through the air. Nia hissed in pain, her golden eyes flashing with rage. "You are stronger than I thought," she spat. "But you will not defeat me." Mrs. Tumi met her gaze unwaveringly. "I don't need to defeat you," she said calmly. "I only need to make you understand one thing: stay away from Zara." With a final, decisive strike, Mrs. Tumi managed to pin Nia's massive form to the ground, her staff pressing into the serpent's throat, forcing her to submit. The power in the air was thick, and for a moment, there was only silence, broken by Nia's labored breathing. "You will never harm her again," Mrs. Tumi declared, her voice low but filled with conviction. Nia, defeated and broken, hissed in submission, her eyes filled with both fear and resentment. "I swear it," she murmured, her voice laced with venom. "I will leave her alone, for now." Mrs. Tumi stepped back, her staff still held in a protective stance. The battle was over. Zara's mother had been defeated. Zara, watching from the shadows, felt a strange twist in her heart. She had called upon the dark power of her mother to destroy her enemies, but now, for the first time, she saw the true cost of what that power entailed. Her mother was no longer invincible. And neither was she. The truth unveiled. The morning after the battle had ended, the village of Okubwa was eerily quiet. The winds had settled, and the sky was clear once again, but Zara could feel a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Her mother, Nia, had been defeated, forced to promise never to harm Zara again. But as Zara walked through the village, the questions that had long haunted her mind seemed to intensify. Who was Nia, really? What was she? And why had Zara been so blind to the truth all these years? The weight of the situation hung over her like a dark cloud. She had always relied on Nia's power, used it to control others, to seek revenge, to get what she wanted. But now that the serpent had been defeated, Zara found herself at a crossroads. Her mother's influence was shattered, and in the silence of the morning, Zara realized how much she had been manipulated. She felt lost, unsure of who she was without the shadow of Nia looming over her. In a haze of confusion and desperation, Zara made her way to Mrs. Tumi's house. She had to know what had happened to her mother. Zara couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Mrs. Tumi, for all her strength, had never shown any fear of Nia's power. What if Nia wasn't the force she had always believed her to be? What if her mother's defeat wasn't just a result of Mrs. Tumi's strength, but of something deeper? Mrs. Tumi greeted Zara quietly as the girl entered her home, her expression unreadable. The teacher did not ask any questions but simply motioned for Zara to sit. It was as if she already knew why Zara was there. "Where is she?" Zara's voice trembled as she spoke, the weight of the question pressing on her. "Where is my mother?" Mrs. Tumi's eyes softened, but there was no pity in them. Only calm understanding. She rose and gestured to the back of the house. "Follow me," she said quietly. Zara followed her teacher through the modest house, her heart beating faster with each step. The air in the house felt different today, heavier somehow, and Zara couldn't shake the sense of dread crawling up her spine. They reached a narrow hallway at the back of the house, where a small door stood ajar. Mrs. Tumi pushed it open, revealing a hidden room, dimly lit by a flickering candle. Zara's breath caught in her throat as she stepped inside. At first, she couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. Her mother, Nia, was coiled in the center of the room. But this was not the woman Zara had known. Nia's massive serpent form lay in a tangled heap, her shimmering scales marred by bruises and cuts. Her once glowing eyes were dull, and her body was battered from the fight. Zara stood frozen in shock, her mind struggling to process the sight before her. This wasn't the woman who had raised her, the woman who had filled Zara's life with power and fear. No, this was something else entirely. "Mama," Zara whispered, her voice barely audible as she slowly stepped closer. What happened to you?" Nia's eyes fluttered open, and she hissed softly in pain. "Zara," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "You should not have come here. It is too late for you to turn back." Zara's heart pounded as a rush of emotions flooded through her. She could see the truth now, the truth that had been hidden from her for so long. Her mother wasn't human. Nia was a serpent, a creature of unimaginable power. The scales that once gleamed like liquid gold, the eyes that glowed with fire, everything about her had been a lie. Zara had always thought her mother was different, yes, but she never imagined the depth of that difference. The pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. Nia had never been the protective mother she had appeared to be. She had manipulated Zara from the very beginning, using her to fulfill her own dark desires. The love that Zara had thought she shared with Nia now seemed like a twisted version of affection, based on control and fear. "You're not my real mother," Zara whispered, her voice breaking. She sank to her knees in front of Nia, her heart heavy with grief and betrayal. I didn't know. I thought you loved me. I thought you were protecting me." Nia's golden eyes flickered with something that might have been regret, but there was no apology in her voice. "I gave you everything," Nia replied, her voice filled with a bitter, hollow tone. "I gave you power, protection, strength. What more did you want?" Zara shook her head, her tears flowing freely now. "I wanted a real mother. I wanted love. I wanted to be free." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the realization of what Zara had truly lost. She had been living a lie, and now she had to face the consequences of it. Mrs. Tumi stepped into the room, her presence steady and calm. "Zara," she said softly, her voice firm but gentle. "You don't have to continue this. You don't have to be a part of your mother's darkness anymore. You have a choice." Zara looked up at Mrs. Tumi, confusion and pain still clouding her eyes. "A choice," she repeated, her voice raw. "What choice do I have? I don't even know who I am anymore." Mrs. Tumi knelt beside her, her gaze steady and compassionate. "You have the choice to break free, Zara. You can choose to live your life without your mother's influence. It won't be easy. It will take great strength, but you are stronger than you think. You can create your own path, free from her control." Zara's heart twisted in her chest. The thought of cutting ties with Nia, of turning her back on everything she had known, was terrifying. But deep down, Zara knew that Mrs. Tumi was right. Her life had been defined by the fear and power her mother had imposed upon her. But that life had never truly been hers. If she wanted to be free, truly free, she would have to face the pain of letting go. "I want to be free," Zara whispered, her voice trembling but filled with a newfound determination. "I want to break free." Mrs. Tumi smiled, her eyes warm with encouragement. "Then you will, Zara. And I will help you." Zara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle in her chest. It was the first step toward freedom, and though it scared her, she knew it was the only way forward. As she looked at Mrs. Tumi, a sense of hope flickered within her, a hope that, with time and courage, she could rebuild her life and become the person she was meant to be, freedom and a new beginning. Zara woke up to the sound of birds singing outside her window, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. It was an ordinary morning, but to her, it felt like the start of something extraordinary. The darkness of her past, the fear and manipulation that had haunted her for so long, was finally starting to fade. She had made the decision to break free from the grasp of her mother, Nia. But she knew that the true test was yet to come. Nia wouldn't give up so easily. She would fight to keep Zara in her control, and Zara had to be ready. The morning passed slowly, the air thick with anticipation. Zara knew that she had to face her mother once and for all. Nia would not be content with her daughter's defection. The serpent had always been powerful, and now that Zara had chosen to defy her, Nia would come for her. As evening approached, Zara stood with Mrs. Tumi outside the small house, looking out at the quiet village. Her heart was heavy, but there was a strength inside her now, one that had come from Mrs. Tumi's guidance. She had spent the last few weeks training, learning how to harness her own inner strength, how to stand on her own 2 feet without relying on Nia's dark powers. Mrs. Tumi had taught her how to channel her emotions, how to use her fear as fuel for courage. Zara was no longer the frightened girl she once was. "Are you ready?" Mrs. Tumi asked, her voice calm yet steady. Zara nodded. "I'm ready." Just as the words left her lips, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A cold wind swept through the village, the skies darkening in an instant. Zara turned toward the horizon, her heart sinking. She could feel Nia's presence, dark and oppressive, closing in on them. The battle that Zara had been dreading was about to begin. From the edge of the village, a massive shape emerged from the trees, a serpent, larger than anything Zara had ever seen. Its glowing eyes fixed on Zara, filled with rage and disbelief. Nia had come, furious that her daughter had betrayed her, determined to take Zara back by force. "Zara," Nia's voice boomed, echoing through the air, laced with venom. "You think you can escape me? You are nothing without me. I gave you power. I gave you everything." Zara stood tall, her feet planted firmly on the ground. The fear that once consumed her had been replaced by a fierce determination. This time, she would not run. She would not cower. "I'm not your pawn anymore, Mama," Zara said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "I don't need you. I never did." Nia's massive form coiled through the air, hissing with rage. "You are mine. You belong to me. And I will not let you go." The serpent's body lashed out, striking with incredible speed. But Zara, empowered by her own strength and Mrs. Tumi's lessons, stepped forward, meeting her mother's fury with calm resolve. With a deep breath, Zara focused all of her energy, the lessons she had learned coming to the forefront. She didn't rely on anger anymore, she used her calm, her focus. And in that moment, she felt the magic inside her stir. It wasn't dark power, but something pure, something of her own. She extended her hand toward Nia, her voice clear and strong. "Leave me alone, Mama. I am not yours to control." The air around Zara shimmered with energy, and for the first time, she felt in complete control. A pulse of light shot from her outstretched hand, striking Nia with a force that sent the serpent crashing to the ground. Nia hissed in pain, her massive form writhing, struggling to regain her strength. But Zara's power was unwavering. "This is where it ends, Mama," Zara said, her voice firm. "You will never control me again." With Mrs. Tumi standing by her side, offering silent support, Zara's power grew. Together, they called upon the light, the energy that had been dormant inside Zara all along. The curse that Nia had placed on her began to unravel, breaking apart piece by piece. With a final cry of rage, Nia was pulled into the very earth beneath them, her form dissolving into the shadows as she was banished to another realm, one where she could never return. The earth rumbled as the serpent's power faded, and Zara felt the weight of her mother's presence lift from her chest for the first time in years. As the dust settled and the air grew still, Zara looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. It was over. The curse was broken. Her mother was gone, and Zara was free. "You did it," Mrs. Tumi said quietly, a proud smile on her face. "You've broken the curse." Zara nodded, her eyes filled with both relief and sadness. She had won her freedom, but at the cost of losing the only family she had ever known. She knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but it was hers to walk. The days that followed were filled with change. Zara began the slow process of rebuilding her life. She apologized to the people she had hurt, the teachers she had threatened, the classmates she had intimidated. It wasn't easy, and there were many who still feared her, but Zara didn't mind. She had no control over their perceptions. All she could do was be honest, be kind, and prove, day by day, that she was no longer the person she had been. With Mrs. Tumi's guidance, Zara worked hard to earn back the trust of the people in the village. She studied, volunteered, and helped where she could. The once feared girl now walked through the village with her head held high, not out of arrogance, but out of a quiet confidence. For the first time, she felt at peace with herself. But even as Zara took her first steps toward a new life, she couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered in the shadows. One afternoon, as she walked alongside Mrs. Tumi through the village market, Zara paused. Her senses were heightened, her eyes scanning the area, but there was nothing she could see. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted. "Do you feel it too?" Zara asked quietly, her gaze flickering around them. Mrs. Tumi, who had always been calm, now looked more alert. "Yes," she said, her voice grave. "You may have broken the curse, Zara, but Nia's influence doesn't disappear easily. She's gone, but the shadows she cast may linger for a long time." Zara nodded, her heart heavy with the realization that her journey wasn't over yet. She had defeated the serpent, but the shadows of her past would take time to fade. She had made the first step toward freedom, but the true battle for her future was only just beginning. As they continued to walk through the village, Zara felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She was no longer the girl who feared her own mother, no longer the pawn in someone else's game. She was free. And though the shadows may remain, she would face them with courage and strength, ready to carve out her own destiny. The path to her true freedom had only just begun.